The Next Step program is brought to you by Heal Her Art, a wellness program for women veterans. You have received a craft kit for enamel painting. The kit includes all the materials you will need to create the Wildflowers enamel paintings. You will need to supply a cup of water to rinse your brushes and a few paper towels. You have several pieces of Yupo paper in your kit. This will be used to learn to paint wildflowers. Yupo paper is synthetic paper that is waterproof, stain resistant, and extremely strong. Since it is waterproof, it's a great surface to use for our practice painting. We'll use a half a page per painting. You can use many common grocery containers and plate glass from found picture frames as your painting canvas. I like to get larger pieces of plate glass from picture frames sold at thrift shops. Please be careful and tape edges of the plate glass prior to painting so you don't cut yourself while moving the glass around. Here are some tips that will help you master enamel paint on glass. To clean glass, use a standard glass cleaner, rubbing alcohol, or dish soap. The enamel paint in this kit is water cleanup. This paint works best if little to no water is added. Enamel paint is thin, but it's not like glass paint, which lets the light through. This paint is opaque. Enamel paint dries fast, so once you put that paint on your palette, paint until you've finished with those colors or flowers. I recommend to only dish out the paint that you'll be using at that time. Enamel paint can provide vibrant colors if painted in thin layers. If the paint dries on your skin or brushes, just wash a bit more aggressively with mild soap. Depending on how much and the color, enamel paint can be considered like nail polish on skin. It may take a couple days to wear off. The blazing star wildflower is a beautiful North American native perennial that thrives in full sun. This eye-catching bloom is found wild in prairie lands. Commonly, the flowers vary from purple tones and whites. Looking at the plant to break down the details, you see that the flowers bloom from the top of the spike downward. The lower portion of the stem is covered with short, fuzzy, grass-like leaves. The flowers can look like lavender or fuzzy like in this picture. Here on the bottom left corner, you can see this post bloom has the petals curled back, exposing whatever remaining pollen that may be left in the flower. Let's get started on the blazing star. The colors we're going to be using for the blazing star are green, brown, red, white, and purple. You can see my colors off to the side here. I've got them in such an order that I'm going to be mixing a few of them together. So I have that white in between the red and the purple so that I can mix up some red and white together, purple and white together. I'm going to be making some brush strokes to represent the stems. Using this larger brush, mixture of the green and brown together. It's okay if some of my stems are a little bit fatter than others because I am going to go back over. Enamel paint is one of those paints that may require additional coats of paint to become more opaque, more visible. I've got a couple of my stems here that are going to be shorter than others. So I've got some nice variety here. I'm also going to throw in some of those leaves, those hair-like leaves. Starting at the bottom, they fan out, and this is still my mixture of green with a tiny bit of brown mixed in. So at the bottom of the stem, remember the leaves are longer. Some will be shorter because they're poking through from the other side. I do want to fill the bottom of the stems up with the leaves. I don't want to go all the way up to the top. I want to leave that open. It's okay if I have a couple of the leaves coming touching the top of the stem. So you can see that I'm fanning them out. They're relatively long. And I can always add more a little bit later. A little bit of fullness here. Remember, some are a little bit shorter, so I'll throw a couple little short ones in the mix. Just a few here and there. Add a little bit more brown to my brush. A little drop of red. Mix that in with the green and the brown. Just a little bit of red. And I'm going to continue through to the top. Nice thin line. And I'll start that off maybe halfway down, kind of weave it in and out. So brown and red mixed together. Mostly brown, a little bit of red. I'm going to scoop just a tiny bit of green just to tone it down a bit. This mixture here, I'm going to start adding some of those buds, and they are at the midsection of the stem, and they are kind of sparse. They're not a big cluster quite yet. So we just got a few of those here and there, working their way up to the top of the stems. And now as I get closer to the top, I'm really going to go for it. So this is going to be a big cluster here. Now I do want to leave a little bit of that stem showing through. And I'll throw just a little bit here and there. That also does help fill up the flower, so it doesn't look so sparse. Maybe put another coat on the green leaves that are closer to the bottom of the stem. This darker brown-red color represents the buds on the blazing star. We do need to put a highlight on there on the tips of those buds to show that those petals blossom right on out there of those buds. And that color happens to be a light pink tone. So what I'm doing with this light pink tone here, just put this on the tips of my buds. This will read as a highlight. I can use this brush here or that smaller detail brush that comes in the kit. Not all the way to the top, not in this larger section here, is where we're going to put those flower petals. Those purple flower petals are all over the place. Kind of crazy. The petals at the top are a lighter purple tone, so I am going to mix some white and purple together. I like to roll my brush, you can see here on my palette, just to keep the brush in a point. And then these petals, they're kind of haywire, they're real thin. Now we're not completely covering all of that red-brown color that's underneath here. We do still want to see that through. These go in all different directions. Some are long, some are short. Maybe if you put too many close together, that's all right. I'm going to show you how to put some variety in that. To start off though, we're going to get a lot of this lighter purple tone in. So all different directions. Can overlap some of your leaves, can overlap some of your little buds. I'm going to add a little bit more light purple here, but I want to add some dark purple. And when I say dark, it really is just the straight purple tone. I can still see some of that brown coming through, and that I definitely want that. I'm ready to go back in with some light. I'm going to address this overlap here in just a moment, but I'm going to go back in with some light on these other flowers here. If I need to break up a section here that maybe has too much light or too much dark, I can go back in with the dark. I'll come over to this one here. that lighter purple in here and there. Now let's talk about those two overlapping stems. One is overlapping into the other. So let's just say this stem right here is in the back. This stem right here is in the front and overlapping the other stem. Not necessarily ideal, but it happens. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make the stem that is in the back a hair darker so that the stem in the front stands out. In order to do that, I'm going to make my life a little bit easier by just adding the lighter tone to the stem and flowers right in the front. Then I can kind of get the shape of it a little bit better. So I'm just lightening up my purple tone here. Let's add that little pop of white in there. And start adding some of those darker purples, a bit more of the purple to the flower in the back. So what I want to do is I'm going to go around this flower right here. Put more of a more of that darker purple tone over here. Use that light purple like we did with all of the flowers at the tips of the blazing star stems. So we had some of that lighter purple, the straight purple. Gotta get some nice wavy thin lines in there. And now I'm going to go back in with that lighter tone, build up that lighter tone right on top there. Wanted to show you a demonstration of how to do this on the bottle. That lighter purple there, I can throw a little bit more dark back in there if it's a little too light, just to break up some of that. A couple little highlights in here with the very, very light purple, in some cases straight white. Can come back in some of those little buds there, and you can put even a brighter highlight on them. The cardinal flower is easy to identify. It's a tall plant with deep red flowers that have a unique flower shape. The stems are rigid and green. Leaves are narrow and have a bit of length to them. The flower buds, combined with the closed petals, are also narrowed and long. When the flower blooms, the petals point outward in slight different directions. Then, when the petals start to curl back, the flower looks like a mangled fork. Let's paint the cardinal flower. For the cardinal painting, we'll be using green, red, black, and white. I've situated the green and red paint opposite of the black and white on my palette because I'll be mixing white with some green, white with some red, and both the red and green with black. To start off with the cardinal flower, we're going to paint a green stem and green leaves. I'm using this larger round brush. You're going to paint a few stems. This particular plant is tall, just like the blue star. So I'll paint a few stems. I'll also thicken them up just a little bit. This will require more than one coat. Can also put maybe a little sprig down at the bottom there. Alright, since we've got our stems in place, I'm going to take the straight green paint, like I did with the stems, and paint in the leaves. The leaves are very similar to the blue star, that they are narrow and wispy, longer at the bottom, shorter at the top, but they are thicker than the blue star leaves. You can either start at the end or the base of the stem and work your way out. These leaves will be getting thicker as we continue to add color and shade them. This is just the straight green. I'm going to do the same thing with the other stems. At the top of this middle one, I'm going to do some tiny little buds. Moving to the open flowers of the cardinal flower, at the top of the stem, the flowers are bright red, and so we'll use the straight red for that. As the flowers start to curl and die, they become darker red, and we will introduce a little bit of a darker red in the flowers themselves. This will require a couple coats of paint. I'm going to start with the straight red and start putting on some of these really funky and wonky different flowers here with some buds. Some of them are closed. They come sticking out of where the leaves come out of the stem. This one is going to be partially open. It's going to have some of those petals coming out. I do like to use some photos as reference to help get some different shapes so you're not doing the same shape over and over. There we go. There we go. Alright, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. I'll add some of my little dots there for the buds. Some of them haven't opened all the way, so that some of the petals are closed. And I'll put one more down here, maybe two. So it's okay if the red overlaps some of the green in some spots. We're going to be coming back and adding more coats of paint. Maybe some are small because they're heading in the opposite, heading towards the back of the plant. That seems good and full. Those flowers are primarily at the top. You can add as many as you'd like. So if you wanted to bring those flowers down further, you can. Because this is a very tall plant, those flowers do come down. I'm not looking for complete coverage, but I am looking for coverage a little bit more solid. Soon I'll be blending in a dark green and a light green to really give some dimension and depth to this painting. I'm being a little careful around the green around my flowers because I just painted them and I don't want to pick up too much of that paint. If you do end up picking up too much, just go ahead and clean your brush off and then load it up with some more of the paint you need. So I've got another coat of this green paint on many of my leaves. I'm going to put in just a few little wisps. I think they're like mini leaves. They're right in where the leaf meets the stem. And it's not everywhere, just every once in a while. The next step is to add a little bit of dark into our flowers. You can choose to add a little bit of light and make the petals a little bit more vibrant, more of an orange red tone. I'm going to keep mine deep red because when I do my California poppies, I really want that orange to pop and I don't want it to blend into these red flowers. So I'm going to stick primarily with the red, but I am going to make myself a darker red tone. The black is pretty intense, so it's mostly red, tiny bit of black. If I end up making the leaf too dark, when I come back in with my lighter pink tone, I can cover that up. I can also choose to cover it with straight red. Alright, got some variety of the darker tone in my red flowers. Now going to add some light. So in the flowers there is some new growth and there is light hitting flowers, so I will have a highlight, a lighter shade. So I'm going to mix myself up a pink. This pink is mostly more on the red side than pink. It's a very subtle transition, and I'm going to add this sparingly on a petal or two. So I've waited a few minutes and I can see that the green paint is mostly dry. I'm going to now mix up a darker green tone and use this throughout my leaves and stem to give some shadow. That is on the bottom side of the leaves. You can see I'm not really trying very hard to do any blending here with this. The variety of brush strokes that I've already got in place here is contributing to visually a nice blend. This darker green tone, the mixture of black and green, the bottom side of the leaves, I'm going to add a lighter tone. One is going to be green and white mixed together. This is going to be brushed along the top edges of the leaves. There are some spots where I'm putting this color on my leaves, it is overlapping some of the pretty red of my flowers, and I don't want to lose that. So I'll come back and do a little touch up on my red where I need to. So I feel like my leaves have some nice variety, but if I really want to make them pop even more, make an even lighter green tone. A little bit of that light green I originally had on my brush, and I can add that sparingly. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a tiny bit more green in this. Some of my flowers look like they're floating, and I want them to look like they're sitting and nestled right into where the leaf and the stem meet. So I'll pick up some green paint here. It's a little bit of green right where they meet. A couple maybe little leaves coming from that point. Helps give it a nice complete look. And now we have our cardinal flowers. The California poppy is often used in wildflower mixes. It's easy to grow and drought tolerant. You can see the flowers are generally one color with some subtle variations. This identifies individual petals where they overlap or where the light is shining on them. The stems are thin and leaves are hair-like. Let's paint the California poppy. Here's the California poppy. On this piece of Yupo paper, my base is orange-red tone. On this paper in my left hand, the base is a yellow tone. You may want to play with a different color base depending on the glass colored surface that you are painting on. To paint the California poppy, I'm using a combination of red, yellow, and green. You can see I am reusing my palette today from a previous painting. So I've got my red, yellow, and green, predominantly yellow, not very much red at all. And I noticed when painting these poppies, and you can see in this example here, that you can still see through the petals of the poppies and the stem comes through. So we definitely want to paint the flowers and buds of the poppies prior to painting the stems because we don't want that to happen. I'm using that larger round brush and I'm going to be using the orange technique pictured right here where I'm pointing versus the starting with the yellow base, which is where I'm pointing right now. So I'm going to mix up some yellow with some red, very little red. And I'm going to build up some layers. This is going to take a little bit of extra time because the layers are going to be a little bit thicker. We're going to want this paint to be a little bit more opaque. So let's get a few poppy shapes in place here. We're not worrying about the petals quite yet. They do point mostly upwards, but some can kind of lean to the side there. Relatively a rectangle shape. So I've got my shapes there. I'm going to let this dry up and then put another coat right over top. So we're going to speed up the pace here and get moving along on this. Now that we've got a couple coats, on the base of our flowers here, we're going to be adding some dark. So what I did is I mixed up some more orange tone. And this more roundish one, I'm going to be adding more of this red tone towards the center. Going to be adding more of the reddish orange tone on the outside, half of the front of this section here. So it gives the illusion of a petal right in front there. Got another petal in the front here that will be a little bit darker. And the whole front of this particular flower will be dark. Now I'm going to start adding some lighter yellow tones on the outside sections here. It's not straight yellow quite yet. So this will be a ring around the dark section there. Blend it a little bit towards the center. Paint a little bit of a lighter tone on some of those back petals. Really just making up the shapes as I go. Just adding some of that yellow to represent light bouncing off of those petals in the background, where the petals in the front are a little bit darker. After this coat of paint dries, I may need to add another just to make it a little bit more vibrant. Alright, so now I'm going to make some of these darker sections a little bit more dramatic. That is, with a little bit more red added to it. And I can always go back in here, mix in some of that yellow with it to lighten it up if I need to. But right now we're building these layers up so there can be some depth to our flowers here. Now I'm just giving this one circular one a little bit more of a organic edge so it's not so perfectly round. It's got more red towards the center here. You may decide that you might just want to keep it as a red poppy. So I'm going to let this set up a little bit here. Then we can add a little bit more detail to it in a bit. So as you can see on my other flowers here, I've got some darker sections in the front, and now I need some more of a medium tone behind that. Now this, though it is all one petal here, I'm going to just add this lighter tone in. Let this set up a bit, and then we'll start adding some highlights. I'll be adding this lighter tone, which is mostly yellow, maybe a tiny bit of red, to some of those back pieces there. You can also add some yellow to those pieces in the front. Doesn't all have to be very dark. I'm going to start using some of that yellow tone to really outline and define some of my petals in this smaller round flower. I'm going to switch back and forth between some of that darker orange, lighter orange. I can use that straight yellow to help me create some edges. I can also use the straight red or a darker orange tone. Just one of those little petals. Can also give you maybe, if you want, a few little veins. It's a little bit of straight red in the center-ish of that flower. So you can do that same type of line with the yellow. That will help break up and define some of those pieces. Sometimes I just blend it right in, petal. Now move on to the stems. So the stems are very thin lines. They can be green, brown, a mixture of the red and green together. You can get a neutral earthy tone there. So for the poppies, I've got a little section at the bottom here. Looks kind of like just a dash. And then it's got a nice thin line that comes down. We actually have some little pieces. The leaves are just kind of small little pieces. So I can move over to that small round brush for some smaller fine detail. I did end up adding a little bit more red tone to help define each individual petal of my California poppy. I do want to point out that you are going to want to add some yellow, just a little bit of yellow in the center if the center is visible for your poppy. If you wanted to make it more of a red poppy, the center would be a black-brown combination there. The compass plant is a member of the sunflower family. It's a tall plant and flowers are spread over the majority of the stem. This is a nice filler for our wildflowers painting. Here, the compass plant has a thicker stem with predominantly open flowers. There are some variations with buds being partially open. The leaves are comprised of narrow sections that are angled and taper at the top. Let's paint the compass plant. Being that the compass flower or the compass plant is so similar to the sunflower, I'm going to paint it as such. I'm using a combination of yellow, green, and black, mostly yellow here. And I'm going to start with the open compass plant flower. Straight yellow and my large round brush. You may need to rotate your painting surface here. The compass flower has 15 to 34 petals, so no worries on trying to figure out how many petals you've got. So there is the open flower. I'm going to do the flower that is on the side here. It's got longer petals on one side and then shorter petals towards the front here. They do come to a point, just a little rounded point. The edge has a little bit of a texture to it, so it's not 100% round or 100% pointy. But for our purposes, the brush does a great job of mimicking that point. So there is the flower bud that is open, but a hair to the side. Then we've got some of these buds off to the side. So we'll let this dry and put another coat of straight yellow on after this has set up. We're now putting the second coat of yellow on the compass plant flower. Next we'll want to add in a little bit of a shading tone to represent these petals overlapping in the compass plant. I'm going to be mixing yellow, very little bit of green, and a very little bit of black. This makes a very dark color. You may need to get a little bit more yellow also just to lighten up that color. So starting from the center portion, I'm just going to add real light, just a little bit of this darker color that I just mixed up. I'm using it sparsely. I can use the yellow to help soften and blend in that green tone I just put in. I should have about 3 to 4 coats at this point of the yellow on the flower itself. I'll let this set up, and I'll add a little bit more of that green in some spots, and then a center of the flowers. Let's continue. We're going to be making a mixture similar to the mixture we already made, the green, yellow, and black. And it's going to be mostly the green and black combination. Now we don't need to use this color in every flower, but we are going to be using it for the centers of the 2 open flowers. This flower here is open on the side. We aren't going to have a perfect circle because visually those petals are covering over top of center. I like to give a little stipple texture to the center. And again the stipple. Using that mixture that we made before, that kind of mucky green tone, use that to start putting a little bit more variety in the flowers close to where the centers are. And then also in our mostly closed buds here. I'm gonna put a base to that. So we'll let that set up a little bit. And while we're doing that, we can play around with some of those highlights and shadows in the flowers. And then you can always add a little bit more yellow in some parts and blend some of that in. Very little pressure here so that it is see-through to that yellow underneath. Alright, now we're ready for some stems. The stems are a green tone, and I'm going to just use that green tone that I've already made. And a lot of these are connected, so I'm just going to assume that we're connected, these 2 here. So we'll let that set up, and we'll put another coat on, darken it up in some spots, and then add a little bit of leaves. So add a little bit more detail in our flowers, but then also another coat of this dark color on our stems. I can add a little bit of a darker detail. So let's talk about these leaves here. If you want to fill up with some leaves, they go all over the place, but they are relatively uniform. There are sections that come off, but those sections have small little sections attached to them. You can use that fine detail brush for this step here. You can add as much filler or not as you'd like. Let me show you what I've been working on. Here's my example on clear glass. It will be very vibrant on the dark glass. The bloodroot wildflower is a member of the poppy family. This white flower is comprised of 8 or more petals. The center is light yellow. The stems are more brown than they are green. The large green leaves come from the stem base and are easily curled. We may or may not be able to fit these leaves into our wildflower painting when we paint on glass. Our petal variations will be using brown and black paint to make mottled whites. Let's paint the bloodroot flower. For the bloodroot flower, let's mix a light gray tone. I only put out white and black for right now. It's going to be a little bit challenging to see this variation on the white Yupo paper, but I will use a little bit more gray tones so that it is easier to see. So I've got my light gray tone here, and I'm going to put a few petals in place. Almost looks like a tulip type shape. This is our open flower here. And let's do one more here. Our base coat has dried, and now we're going to pick up some white. We want to go back and forth between the white and the gray, so I'm going to just have some gray mixed up since my gray did dry from the first go around. So I can go back and forth between the white and the gray, and I'm going to start painting in these petals. They're a little bit grayer in the front, so what I'm going to do is over top that white that I just put down, I'm just going to blend in some gray tone. So I'm painting in the white sections here. The petals are darker the closer they are to me. And I've got these 2 petals that are in the front here, and I can be really dramatic with it if I wanted to make them much darker. I can come back in and lighten that back up also after that coat sets up. Alright, so now we want to start identifying the different petals of some of these open flowers. And it is mostly white or lighter towards the outer edge and darker as it gets closer to the center. You can see I'm leaving some of that gray underneath showing through. That is really nice to provide some variety in those shades, each individual petal. I can come back in and I can darken some sections up. So I've got 2 petals here that are one right next to the other. And you can see it is a little hard to identify where is one versus the other. I'll let that set up a little bit and I'll come back and I can add a little bit more of gray tone to it. And so as this coat of white sets up, I can go back in and I can put some highlights in. Really have some things show a lot of contrast. This particular flower here has a lot of contrast. Let's see, we want to lighten it up a little bit, no problem. There. So you could use maybe the blue. Blue would be your dark tone, and so then your flowers would have this beautiful blue tone to them. I have an example of something I was working on. I can show you that. Here's the start of some blue flowers. You can see that would make some really gorgeous flowers there, some nice wildflowers. Mine are a little bit on the drastic side, but that's because I really want you to see what I'm painting. We're going to let this set up, and then we're going to start talking about the center of the flowers. We can go right into the stems. So the stems are going to be green, yellow, and white, maybe a little bit of red. So I've put some paints on my palette. I've got some yellow, red, green. I added a little bit more white, and I mixed up some white in the green. So I've got a nice light green tone, and I'm going to add these stems in place here. Flowers are individual. Stems can go one direction or the other. We're still letting our flowers dry up a bit, and we're going to talk about these leaves. These leaves are very large, and they're very shapely, very curved. They can be displayed closed up, and I'm going to put just a basic coat here of the leaves. And you can see the leaves are so big that you may not even want to include them at all in your paintings. I'm going to mix in a little bit of yellow in with that, a little bit of white. They're very large. I'll let this set up for a bit. We'll come back and we'll add a little bit more detail to them and move back to our flowers. Those flowers, there is a little bit of detail at the base of the bulb of the flower where it meets the stem. And so that color is a mixture of yellow, green, and maybe even red, so a brown tone. I'm going to add just a tiny bit of red into my mixture here. I added a little bit of yellow, white, green, and red, just a little bit. And I'm going to see if I can add a little bit of this to it. The center of the flowers are predominantly a greenish tone with yellow pieces that stick out. So that green is a soft green. I'm going to use the green and white together. Once that sets up, I'm then going to add some yellow for that fine detail for the center of the flower, for where the pollen is, and I can use that really small round detail brush for that if I wanted. In the bloodroot flower, the leaves are very large and irregular shaped, but because there's so many cast shadows, it is hard to get a good defined shape on them when painting them as if they are just growing in the wall. Take my green, a little bit of yellow, and just a tiny bit of red just to deepen that. And I'm going to go back over these leaves here. So another coat over the leaves. You can see they're just like big blobs right now. We have yet to put in some of those veins and lighter spots. So I just put in another coat of green and a little bit of yellow in there just to lighten up some of the areas. Our stems only have one coat on them, and they are very faint and light. So I'll use the white paint and mix in a little bit of green and a little bit of yellow, maybe even a little bit of red. You can use that fine detail brush if you like for this step here. It will read as a grayer tone. To minimize that, just add a little bit more green and less of the red. But I'm going to utilize this color here to help me give a little bit of an outline to some of my leaves. I'll let that set up, and then we're going to add a little bit of veining in the leaves. And then we're just about done. Going back to those small center detail in our flower here with the pollen, use that fine detail brush. Now you may have a hard time seeing this detail here. Just a few brush strokes. That pollen's really thick, so I'm going to load that on. Got our pollen in the center portion of our bloodroot wildflowers. We'll let the leaves set up a little bit before we start adding some veins. So I apologize if some of this detail may get lost with the bloodroot flowers because they are white and I'm using more of a black and gray tone so that you can see more of that detail. Moving on to these leaves here, and I want to put some veins in the leaves. I'm using that extra small detail brush for those veins. So they come up very subtle and they have that kind of a little bit squiggly motion to them, working them their way to the outer edge of the leaf itself. And I'm going to assume this is folded and I'm going to put some of the veins going one direction instead of both. Got two little sections here on this particular extra large leaf. Doesn't necessarily need to be completely solid lines, just implied. And there we are, the bloodroot wildflower. If you would like to add more wildflowers, look at your painting overall. Maybe you can add a few more of a specific flower as filler, or identify what colored flowers you are missing and would like to add. I think I want some blue wildflowers. I do an internet search for blue wildflower. Selecting from the wildflowers that I see, I like the narrow leaf blue-eyed grass pictured here. It looks nice. Botanical drawings can also help. So do a search for botanical drawings and the name of your plant. So I will do a search in images for botanical drawing, narrow leaf, blue-eyed grass. Paintings and drawings of the flowers simplified will populate. Some of these images will help you break down shapes and colors. Curing enamel paint on glass. Oven curing is the most durable and preferred. Allow your paint to dry for 24 hours before proceeding. Place the glass on a tray in a cool oven. Preheat your oven to temperature 350 degrees. I cure my enamel projects right before bed in the evening, so while I'm preparing for bed and the next day, the paint is cooking. Once it's cooked for 30 minutes, I can turn the oven off and let it slowly cool down overnight. I look forward to the next morning to see my masterpieces. You can wash your painted glass on the top rack of a dishwasher, but I recommend washing by hand. Do not microwave any glass with enamel paint. An alternative cure is air dried. Let your paint dry for 21 days. This option is good for decorative applications only.